Welcome to the No More Sex Shame video series. Today we are talking with Maggie McNeill, who is an author and writer and activist for sex worker rights and freedom. And Maggie, what would you be interested in sharing with me about how shame impacts sex workers?
Well, David, I think shame is one of the biggest problems facing sex workers. And when I say one of the biggest problems, the other one, of course, being criminalization. But the interesting thing, I think, is that the two of them feed each other. So a lot of the what's being used to justify further criminalization these days is the pretense that the state wants to protect sex workers. And so all these supposed negative effects of sex work on the sex worker are dredged up and they're used to justify criminalization. But the problem is a lot of those negative effects, stigma, shame, sense of isolation, psychological pressures of various kinds, anxiety, depression, a lot of these things come from the shame and the criminalization that society is inflicting on sex workers in the first place. So in other words, they do something to us, inflict shame, inflict the threat of criminal implications, and then the effects, the natural effects that anybody's going to have from living under that are then used as excuses to justify inflicting more shame and inflicting more criminal penalties.
Yeah, you saying that makes me think. I mean, there is a lot of public shaming associated with sex work, and with the criminal process. I mean, the way they talk about putting people's pictures or driver's licenses and stuff in the news if they get caught visiting a sex worker, or all of the all the media around sex trafficking and sex worker sort of stuff. There is this kind of public shaming of sex work embedded in
it. Absolutely. And when you think about it, it's the only misdemeanor that's treated that way, right? We don't see public shaming with photographs of people who have a fine for littering, or who were caught shoplifting, or any of these other kinds of misdemeanors. But for some reason, sex work, it's treated as if it were a felony, even when it's a misdemeanor. You'll have these rows and rows of pictures of clients, and again, all they're being charged with is patronizing a prostitute, a misdemeanor. And sex workers themselves, one of the things I notice is that they love doing this thing of printing mugshots when they're in stories with sex workers. And of course, no person looks their best in a mugshot, right? And so the media seems to enjoy, they seem to think it's funny, the idea that, oh, look at how goofy and ridiculous this woman looks. Who would pay her for sex? They don't say that, but there's that implication.
Oh, wow, that's a really thoughtful point I've never caught, and you're right. And God, that's gross.
It is gross. It's extremely gross. And it's because they'll pick, and the UK media is extremely bad with this, even worse than the United States media, where they'll have this, they'll actually be there with the cameras during a raid and dragging these girls out in the street in their underwear, things like that. And when you think about this, it's positively medieval. It really is. It reminds me of Jane Shore, the courtesan who was forced to walk in her nightgown down the street in Henry VIII's reign as a penalty for, Henry VIII? I don't remember which one. It was around that time. War of the Roses, or end of the War of the Roses. Henry IV, maybe. Anyway, that it was, the idea was to shame her for doing something. Oh, well, you were caught at this, and so we're going to make a fool of you. And a lot of the penalties, when you think about it, around sex work, and I mean, when I say penalties, I mean both criminal penalties and non-official penalties, like public shaming, are revolving around this notion, this idea that, well, you're being bad, you're being naughty, you're being transgressive, you're doing things that good girls shouldn't do. And so in a sense, it's almost this infantilizing kind of a punishment. It's like something you do to a child. It's like the things the nuns used to do. You're drawing a circle on a chalkboard, making you put your nose in it, or making you stand in a wastebasket, or something like that. The idea is public humiliation. That is the punishment. And it's a very infantilizing kind of a punishment. It's almost like we're not treating sex workers and clients as fully functional adults. We're treating them as children that just need a good, healthy dose of shame to push them back into proper behavior. By golly.
You know, Maggie, that's just a brilliant point. And first, let me say that I'm embarrassed and mildly ashamed that you know British history, and it sounds like Shakespeare much better than I do. Because, you know, I remember War of the Roses and Henry IV and Henry VIII. Yeah, I kind of remember, but you're blowing me away. But
well, it's my field, though, David. I mean, this is my thing. You know, I mean, I research this and I write about it. And
that's awesome. I love, but you know, you're right. We potty train children.
Yes.
By shaming them.
Yes.
By saying, oh, that's gross. Oh, you're gross. We don't want to be around you, you know, with poo-poo, and you got to go in the potty because that's what real people, good people do. You're right. As we shame adults, we're treating them like children.
Yeah, very much so. And one of the things I think is really, really interesting with me as a very public sex worker, right? I mean, I've been in the business for 17 years, and any shame I might have at one time felt is long, long, long gone, right? But it's really interesting that when people who are not cops, right, want to try to correct a sex worker, when they want to try to put social pressure to shame her, because that's all they have, right? They keep falling back on these same tired old forms of insult and things like that. And so you'll see this both with just regular people on the internet, and you'll also see it with prohibitionists, right? If they don't have themselves guns and legal force, to stop you, they will try this stuff like, well, I'll have people on the internet they'll call me a whore, and I'm like, yes, your point being, so you read my bio, right? I mean, right, that's what I am. I am a whore. I mean, deal with it. And so, but they think throwing that word against me will shame me, will make me feel bad. And with the prohibitionists, one of the things we see is this really very adolescent kind of fixation on sex and individual sex acts. And so you'll see prohibitionists say things like, well, why should anybody respect what you have to say? You make your living with men's dicks in your mouth, or that sort of thing. As if the act of performing sex on someone was intrinsically shameful. It's like, I suck dicks. Duh. I mean,
yeah, why should we listen to you? You sell your body. You sell yourself.
Right. Right. And so it's weird because there's a disconnect there in the sense that the weapon they're trying to use is not a weapon that's really effective on me, and they don't understand why it's not effective. They don't get that.
Tell me that. That's the other thing I want to hear is, how did you make it so that shaming wasn't effective on you? I mean, you embracing the word whore. Yeah. How'd you do that?
I'm not sure. Part of it, I've always been kind of whorish. Even when I was, in high school and such, that kind of concept never really bothered me that much. I'm not saying I'm immune to sex shame, because I'm not, right? And I have been very effectively shamed by other people in other ways. But for some reason, the money for sex thing and the promiscuity thing, those things never really managed to get me. The kinds of shaming that I find have been effective on me is coming up in the 80s as a young lesbian. I found, well, bi, right? And that was the problem because I was bi. So lesbians would shame me for being bi, right? It's like I'm not a real lesbian. Or they'd shame me for specific things I wanted to do or that I was interested in. And so that kind of shaming did work on me, right? Because I perceived those people who were doing it as part of my group. But I think one of the reasons that the reason that the prohibitionist shaming doesn't work on me is I don't perceive them as members of my group.
Right.
They're not sex workers. They're not clients. They're not allies. They're enemies. And so that kind of shaming, I'm like, well, yeah, you feel that way. You're not me. You know, you're outside. And so I think the line comes because I've known sex workers who were very affected by that kind of shaming. When I had my escort service, I did a duo one time with multiple guys with a younger girl, and one guy uttered the word whore at some point, and she got really upset. She started crying because she had not internalized that as her identity, right? Whereas I have. And we throw it around with each other all the time. We call each other whores. We say, you know, whore party, whore friends, all that kind of thing. And so we've internalized that. We've taken on that identity, right? But I think for someone who's young in the business, who's just starting out, and if she doesn't embrace that as her identity, if she still thinks of herself as part of that group that are the ones who are throwing those insults, that can be very hurtful. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, so you would support her by kind of reframing that identity, as you said, embracing it, kind of owning it, taking away the power of that shame.
Yes, and one of the things we do online with each other that sex workers online often do is we take the shoe off the foot that they're trying to put it on and put it on the other foot. So we will kind of, and we're not shaming them back, really. Is that what we're trying to do? What we're trying to do is we're trying to reframe the conversation, right? So in other words, you'll see us online making jokes like, ooh, why would any woman do that for free? That's disgusting. You know, that kind of thing. And of course it's a joke, right? But it's meant to be, oh, look at this from a different angle, right? Or one thing I will often do is I will, it's hyperbole, of course, but I'll joke, right? Some of the arguments, the idea that whores are dirty, that we spread disease. And of course, you know, as a sex researcher, and so do I, that the rate of STIs in the general population is much higher than the rate of STIs among sex workers. Mm-hmm. And so whenever I see an article about something like, you know, STI rates are going up among college students, whatever, I'll tweet something like, dirty amateurs, they should be licensed and regulated, you know. And of course I'm not serious about this, right? But the idea is to switch the narrative, to throw that shoe in the other foot, to go, oh, you're trying to shame us? Okay, here's what it feels like, you know.
To respond to the process rather than that content, that manipulative shaming tool, and pull back and say, hey, let's look at this from a bigger picture and talk about what's really going on here.
Correct. And it's not being done when I do things like that. I'm not doing it for the edification of the general public. I'm certainly not doing it for the people who are throwing the insults. I'm doing it for younger sex workers who are following my feed, and I want them to look at it in this perspective, right? And that's part of what I'm trying to do to help them get over the shame, right?
Yeah, you're empowering them. That's gorgeous.
I'm trying to empower them, right? I'm trying to be like, here's this public figure, right? Here's Maggie McNeill, and she's smart, and she's all this, blah, blah, blah. And, oh, gosh, if Maggie's not shamed by this, maybe I shouldn't be either, right? Because that's what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about what people who want me in the jail think. I'm concerned about my sisters and how they feel. And that's part of my contribution is to creating that, right? To having that sense of sisterhood, that sense of no, you're one of us. You know, you're with us. And that's one of the beauties that I find in Seattle. Younger escorts here in Seattle, I think, there's no way for me to know this, is to study, you know, hundreds of escorts to tell. But my feeling, my gut feeling, is that here in Seattle, a lot of the younger escorts have a lot less problem with internalized shame than they do in other parts of the country, in part because we have such a supportive sex worker community here. You can go to a party and everybody else there is a sex worker. You know, last weekend I literally went to 2 parties, one on Saturday night and one on Sunday, where everybody, or very close to everybody, was a sex worker. And when you have an environment like that, where you can talk to each other and trade stories and trade, you know, tips and things like that, and talk about clients and talk about stuff you did, and it goes a long way toward, and I'm going to use this word, and it's not a word I like to use, because it's usually used as a pejorative, but normalizing. It goes a long way toward normalizing it. And if you're a young sex worker and you're in your 20s and you're in this room with a bunch of sex workers in their 30s and 40s who are very comfortable and very much like, yeah, we're doing this and we did this and no, I had this client who blah, 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 and doing all this kind of stuff, it makes them feel more like, well, okay, this is fine. There's nothing scary going on here. You know, there's nothing weird. I haven't changed. These people respect me. These people love me. Maybe I can ignore that stuff that's being inflicted from outside.
Yeah, it gives them a foundation. It gives them insulation from the shaming later on.
Yeah, sure. And the shaming going on all the time, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes it doesn't have to be direct, right? We talked about in-groups and out-groups a few minutes ago. And even if nobody around you knows you're a sex worker, and I've heard so many sex workers talk about this, right? Even if nobody around you knows, it can be really humiliating and really stressful to constantly hear people around you talking about dirty whores, even if they don't know you're one, right? Where you're a friend of mine, very long story, but basically she's on probation right now, so she cannot risk being caught doing sex work. So she's doing a regular job now. And what she decided to do was long distance truck driving, of all things. But of course, with the sex trafficking hysteria, right? There's all this talk, all these classes they have to take, and all this kind of people coming talking about, oh, the pathetic, prostituted women and all this kind of stuff. And so she was texting me a couple of weeks ago when she was going through this about the deep humiliation she felt, even though nobody there knew, right? But she was just having to sit here and listen to these lies about her people, right?
I'm glad she had you. I'm glad that was there for her to help protect her from that.
Sure. So she was able to vent to me, and say, oh, I can't believe this. And she even went so far, and it's funny because it was a very affirming thing for her, right? She had a T-shirt that had something like whore power on it or something like that. And so she put on the T-shirt and she kind of dolled herself up and she stood in front of like this Truckers Against Trafficking sign, like giving the finger and a selfie and sent it to me.
I love it.
It's like, yeah, okay, good for you. Kind of internalizing that, right?
So Maggie, what's your feed? How could people find you? You're on Twitter and your blog. What is it?
Yep, Twitter and blog. You can Google Maggie McNeill, and I spell the last name McNeill. And if you Google that, you will find my blog, you'll find my escort ad, you'll find my Twitter feed, you'll find videos of me, you'll find all kinds of stuff.
That's awesome.
So that's the easiest way, is just Google Maggie McNeill.
Okay. Maggie, thanks for doing this.
You're welcome, David.